for lots more details on what I'm going to talk about today, you can go to my website, Dave Franzen, NDSU, scroll down to the extension publications, and then look for fertilizing canola, and voila, there it is. It's I went through it a couple years ago, and we republished it, and so everything that was in there before, as I recall, is pretty much what's in there right now. Not to not to say that in some future year, now that we have soil scientists at Minot and Williston and Langdon, really all of our experiment stations now have a soil scientist, that this couldn't be revisited in the future. But here it is right now, and it was refreshing to hear the previous discussion about irrigation, and they had an N-rate trial, and our recommendations were the ones that worked out best. So anyway, that's the publication. So if I had to summarize it, this is how I would summarize it. The nitrogen is capped. Additional nitrogen is not going to push yield. Your environment is everything. The P should be seed or near seed placed. Potassium to soil indicates it's a problem. Sulfur always, because our sulfur soil test is horrible, and no other micros are not important in this region. All right, so first of all, the recommendations. So there was a lot of work by John Lukács and others around the state a number of years ago. Well, it's been 20 years ago. And what they found is what we find in all of our N-rate work, is that the N-rate that's going to give you the highest yield / profit in a really good year is the N-rate that's going to give you the highest yield, highest profit in a poor year. And you can see this illustrated in the upper left-hand figure just by the comparison between the open pollinated varieties, which are generally lower yielding, than the hybrids, which were kind of new at that time. And if you look at the peak of all those curves, they're in a very narrow range from somewhere around 110 to 150 pounds an acre, and that's where our recommendations are. We don't carve out Langdon area out of these recommendations, because so far, at least, on the data that was generated, they're given about the same peaks as drier areas in the state. So in some other crops, the Langdon area is carved out because the soil itself is a slow release fertilizer, because of the ancient non-exchangeable ammonia within the shale pieces that you find within that whole region. But with canola, I've treated the Langdon area just the same as the rest of the eastern area. So what does this mean for recommendations? So in the western part of the state, where things are warmer, drier, 120 pounds of N is a recommendation. For the moisture areas, including the Langdon area, about 150 pounds of N. So those are not numbers chiseled on the temple wall. I think the 150 should be capped, chiseled on the temple wall. But if a person in the West has evidence that maybe a higher N rate might be justified, then I'm okay with that. But I don't think I'm okay with going any higher than 150, because I've never seen that that's needed. We support over 4,000 pound yields in the northern tier counties with 150 pounds of N, so there's no need. As far as the P and the K goes, they're not yield based. Also, it doesn't really matter. So in the Olson P, if you're in the medium range, that 8 to 11, that 28 pounds of P205 is roughly, not exactly, but it's roughly 50 pounds a MAP per acre. When you get down to the very low and the low recommendations of 60 pounds or so, you can't, I don't think, unless you have really very clay soils and moist conditions, that you can get that high. And so I would concentrate on trying to get some fertilizer with the seed, or if you have the ability to put it near the seed but not with the seed, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute, then I would really strongly encourage you to do that. But I know in some planners it takes an act of God to do that. So, but some of you are configured so that you can. The soil test K for most of you isn't going to be that big of a problem, because you're K-test is way higher than 150, 200 ppm. It's possible in the Southwest, as we grow more corn and soybeans, that those K-tests may plummet. And so I'd strongly encourage you to zone soil test. And for those of you, and make sure that areas of your field aren't really low and they're being masked by higher K tests in other parts of the field. All right, so I promised you the banded stuff. So this is some work from Canada, and these are different rates of P from 0 to 108 pounds an acre. So that's what, about that'd be about 200 pounds a map on the high side. So broadcast, you see that you get really nice yield increases from 0 to 108. But when you band it with the seed, you don't get that. You get it up to that 50 pounds a map area, that 27 pounds of P2O5. You read across, it's 31 bushels an acre times 50. So you max out at that in this study. But then if you have some separation, if you're banding it just maybe an inch and a half or so away from the seed, that those higher P rates can translate into larger yields. But notice that the banded rates at the rates that peak the yield are way higher or than the same rate of P2O5 that's broadcast. So if you're broadcasting P, you're leaving money on the table. So configure yourself so you can get some fertilizer with, or even better, near the seed with some spacing in between. These recommendations are from Alberta, as I recall. We haven't done the same kind of work here in North Dakota, but there's no reason that these can't work here. And I would strongly encourage you to go with the chart. So a lot of you are in the 10, 12 inch row spacings or so. And so in medium, which is say a loam soil, or a heavy would be something like a clay loam soil, or in the northwest part of the state, sometimes you have silty clay loam soils. You can go as high as 5 pounds of N plus K2O. So you're pretty limited on what you can get. So that's 50 pounds a map. If you want to go higher than that, then you really need the separation between the seed. If you're hoe drill, or some people are still air seeders with sweeps, you can go to higher rates because of the spreading out of the seed and or the fertilizer, and so the concentration isn't nearly as high. So that gives you flexibility if you do that. But if you're a classic no-tiller, not many of you are going to want to do that. Just so you know that I consider no-till in the same biological community, whether it's classic no-till, where you're just putting the seeder in the ground, whether you're shallow one-pass seeding, where you're just tickling the top couple inches at the date of seeding, or if you're shank strip till with your row crops. All of those perform biologically the same. So just so you know. All right, so I want to highlight Ed Deibert's work because he had two amazing contributions to North Dakota and regional agriculture. And the first was, most of you probably have small grains in your rotation. It's pretty common in the canola country. So he's the one that developed all those charts, that did all that research behind the charts of if you space your rows 6, 9, 12, 15 with a drill, or with a hoe drill, or with the sweeps and various coverage of soil. He did all that painstaking work with small grains, that where the charts appear in our barley publication, our wheat publications. He's the one, and I can't imagine anybody doing that for the next century. And he was a very quiet person, retired some time ago, and passed away a few years ago. So the other thing, the other major contribution was he prevented a major train wreck in North Dakota when people really started to be serious about canola production. So in 94, 95, Dwayne Berglund and myself and a couple others, we did kind of a tour around the state with canola production. If you recall, in the mid-1990s, wheat was having a terrible time. The canola industry was really wanting to promote canola cultivation in the state, and it was the perfect time for people to start planting canola. And frankly, canola saved a lot of farms because I was just terrible with the scab, and we just didn't have the varieties, didn't have the fungicides. It was an awful time, all that water. So he did the basic work behind the sulfur that told us just how important sulfur was. And if he hadn't have done that, I think maybe we would have had way more train wrecks. I can't even recall a train wreck. So sulfur is really, really important. These are these are images I took during my early career at NDSU when they started 94, 95, 96. Uh, the early sulfur deficiency, which you sometimes can still see on really sandy areas in a really wet season, it has that yellow mottling color. You have this unevenness across the field in that picture on the right, looking from a hilltop down a eroded slope. The area that has more sulfur in it, just because of the sulfate in the groundwater, is way more yellow, and so it's very important. And how important is it? Well, this is how important it is. So this is Ed's work with Scott Hawley, published in 1996. So with a sulfur rate of 0, with no sulfur on this as a true soil scientist, he understood the importance of topography. And so to his credit, and pretty amazing because hardly anybody does this except me, is he put a trial on a hilltop on abuse soil, in a hillside, a barn soil, and a svia, which had way more organic matter toward the toe slope of the field. So on the Buse hilltop, he had 30 pounds of canola with no sulfur, and only 230 pounds on the barns. And the svia had more, of course, because the groundwater has some sulfate in it. When he put just 20 pounds of sulfur on as ammonium sulfate, he increased the yield on the Buse hilltop 5,000% to 1610. I told Ed, I said, if you had lived 1,000 years ago, you would have been given an estate and been the court wizard by figuring this out. It was truly remarkable. There is no yield increase more than this in any nutrient that I'm aware of in the world. So it is extremely sensitive to low sulfur levels. So having some sulfur on it is really, really important. Notice also the ES down there with the sulfur source, elemental sulfur. This is, can't remember what brand he used, but it was a bentonite blended sulfur. You know, it's supposed to have when it deteriorates, it has really, really tiny particles, but our oxidation rate is very low to convert elemental sulfur to sulfate. And even with double the rate as that 20 pounds, yeah, certainly 30 to 600 is a win, and 230 to 140 is a win. But notice just 20 pounds of sulfur is ammonium sulfate, and you added 1,000 pounds on the Buse and 600 with the barn. So my message is, don't bother with the elemental sulfur. You know, just use a soluble form. So that's the story, and that's Ed Dybert's second legacy to farmers in this region. So that's simple, isn't it? Nitrogen, we cap it at 150 pounds of N per acre in the east, 120 N per acre in the west. The 120 you can fudge a little bit if you like. The Langdon region, if you want to consider 130 pound N per acre cap, you can, but I think I'd probably go with 150, plus or minus 20 pounds. It's not that hard to do. So one thing on the nitrogen, and this came out in one of the Q&As, and I responded in it. Did I respond in the text? No, I didn't. So I knew I would address it here. So in our work with oilseed crops, particularly sunflowers, we find that as you increase the nitrogen rate, the oil content decreases. So I don't know exactly what the market gives a producer or gives a processor right now. I suspect that the oil content is more valuable than what the feed content is. And if that's the case, then being a little bit conservative and not overdoing it on the nitrogen rate is going to help the oil content. Right now, there's no oil premium for canola. But I think in the future, um, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a premium for oil. You know, that if you get beyond a certain percentage of oil, you get more for the canola than what you do right now. Right now there isn't, but it has the opportunity to do that in the future if they really want the oil. So just so you have that in your mind, that N rate increased, oil decrease. N rate increase, protein increase. That's how it works. The greater N, if you push it more than 150, as you saw from the Williston slide, it doesn't translate into yield potential. Once you have that rosette down at the base and you start to push up the shoots, the plant has all the nitrogen it's going to need to produce whatever yield the environment's going to give it. So everything after that is temperature and moisture. That's pretty much it. And then apply banded P. If you're not doing that, please do it. You're leaving $100 an acre in the field. It's not smart not to ban phosphate. And then pay attention to the within seed nitrogen. And I wouldn't put any potash on with the seed at all anytime. There's no need for that. If you need it, broadcast it with your nitrogen. And then you always put sulfur on as a sulfate or thiosulfate form. The thiosulfate's a liquid form, and absolutely do not ever put that with the seed. Never, 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 never put that with the seed. And then the last thing is avoid miracle products. What I've told you is what you need to consider. Anything else, if you're really curious about some kind of a new product, try it on replicated strips within the field. Try it on one field and compare it to another is not an experiment. If you find it as positive, it could have just as easily gone the other way. It's just an observation, doesn't tell you anything. Also, splitting a field, doing it on one half and doing it on the other half. I've told people this like 1,000 times. If I stood in the middle of the field and threw a rock over on the left-hand side of the field and didn't throw a rock on the right, half the time, the half that I threw the rock onto would yield more than the place I didn't. That is not an experiment. So replicated strips is the only way to figure out how to do that. So that's me. That's it.